Hello students, welcome to our discussion on Cold War. In the previous lecture, we discussed the meaning of Cold War, the background of Cold War, why the Cold War was not turned as a hot war, then different regions that were cited as the major causes of Cold War. So in this lecture, we will discuss about different phases of Cold War and what are the regions that led to the end of Cold War and different regions that were responsible for the end of the Cold War. So let us start with different phases of Cold War. The first phase starts with 1945 to 1953. After the defeat of Japan in August 1945, because America used nuclear weapons against Japan, not just for once but for twice, and that led it to surrender in August 1945, resulting in the end of the Second World War. So the kind of understanding and the kind of alliance that existed between the two superpowers and also with other countries, that collapsed, and in a major way it was responsible for the misunderstanding and mistrust between the two superpowers. From the USA perspective, the Soviet Union broke its commitment to self-determination which it promised to give to the countries in the Eastern Europe, and also it failed to withdraw its troops from countries like Iran and demanded territorial concession as well as bases from Turkey. All these kind of events and activities forced the United States to follow a very confrontational kind of line against the communist country. The mistrust and suspicion soon turned into geopolitical and ideological competition. These kind of activities from the USA side is considered as a kind of regions that provided a lot of mistrust and suspicion between the two superpowers, engaged in a kind of geopolitical and ideological competition that impacted the international politics for about 4.5 decades. In 1947, the United States pursued what came to be known as the Truman Doctrine, that under which the United States pursued military assistance to Turkey and Greek to arrest the expansion of communism or communist ideology by the USSR. Again, the view that the Soviet Union sought to take advantage of post-war Europe's vulnerability, where communism had considerable appeal, was the motivating force behind the Marshall Plan. Basically that was the plan under which America provided economic assistance to the countries of Western Europe for their reconstruction or to deal with the kind of damage they suffered during the Second World War. Berlin blockade of 1948-49, the successful nuclear test by the Soviet Union in 1949 and the establishment of NATO in 1949, they were all significant events during this beginning phase of Cold War. The Cold War had its origin in the first instance it was a conflict limited to Europe, but from the outset it also posed global challenges, as there was communist revolution in China in 1948 with the Soviet assistance, and the crisis also affected the Korean War in 1950. So although in the beginning the Cold War was considered something related to Europe or the European issues, so in the initial phase of Cold War its impact was felt in two different events in Asia. One was the success of communist revolution in China or mainland China, what we call under Mao's leadership in 1948, and the other was the Korean War, where North Korea attacked South Korea in 1950. The communist revolution was successful because of Soviet Union's assistance, and and both the superpowers, they were engaged with each other indirectly in the Korean War. So in the initial phase you find Cold War was not just limited to Europe, although the main focus or the main concentration of Cold War was Europe. In a way it also affected events and activities outside Europe. Then in the second phase Cold War spreads, and this phase we can identify from 1955 to 1969. The Korean War convinced the United States and its allies that communism was in an aggressive posture and reinforced the sense that it was a kind of monolithic bloc. Communist revolution in China and also the establishment of communism in North Korea, and that too with the USSR support and also with Chinese support, that in a way convinced the United States that the communist ideology was very aggressive, and it was a kind of monolithic bloc that has to be dealt collectively. As such, a concerted global response to contain communist influence was thought to be appropriate, and this prompted the United States to sign a series of alliance treaties in the Asia Pacific, including the Australia, New Zealand, United States Security Treaty in 1955 and the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization in 1954. Although Stalin's death in March 1953 brought a more moderate Nikita Khrushchev to power, the rearmament of West Germany in 1954 led to the creation of Warsaw Pact by the USSR in 1955. So, the United States established NATO in 1949 in the first phase of the Cold War. So, this was retaliated by the USSR in 1955 when it established the Warsaw Pact. Moreover, Soviet support for national liberation movements such as in Congo and Cuba, along with its intervention in Hungary in 1956, confirmed the perception in the United States that the Soviet Union continued to pose a kind of threat to the United States and its allies, and also to their economic and strategic interests around the world. So, these kind of military intervention in countries like Congo, like Cuba, which was very close to the America, so that led to the belief in the United States that these communist bloc led by the USSR, it was posing a kind of direct threat to the America and also to its allies, and also it was affecting very seriously the economic and strategic interest of these countries around the world. Moreover, crisis over Berlin in 1961 and the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, these two events marked the most dangerous moments of the Cold War. In both the cases, there was a risk of direct military confrontation, and certainly in October 1962 the possibility of a nuclear war. So, the kind of military engagement both the superpowers were contemplating during the Cuban Missile Crisis, that led many to believe that there would be a nuclear war between the two superpowers. Fortunately, that situation was averted, but but the fear was there. Growing concern at the proliferation of nuclear weapons led the two superpowers to negotiate the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968, whereas the states that had nuclear weapons committed themselves to halt their nuclear arms race, while those who did not promised not to develop nuclear weapons. So, basically after the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a positive development in the relations between the two superpowers, because they developed a kind of understanding, and it is a kind of common understanding that they have to hold their nuclear monopoly. That is how the NPT came into existence, which in a way tried to reduce the nuclear arms race between the two superpowers, and also it created a kind of permanent nuclear apartheid between the nuclear hubs and the nuclear have-nots. Then the third phase was characterized by the Détente and the second Cold War, which we can keep from 1969 to 1985. The policy of the Détente was a deliberate attempt to improve Sino-American relationship, and the hostility that has emerged between the USSR and China, which provided a kind of strategic opening to both the superpowers. So, in this period there was growing rift between China and the USSR over the question of leadership to the communist countries, and that led to the kind of rift between the two major countries, and this situation was in a way exploited by America, and the kind of common interest they developed for perpetuating the nuclear apartheid, that was also another important reason why there was a kind of détente in this period, and particularly after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, the NPT factor the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Sino-Soviet rift, and the question of leadership in the communist countries, that provided a kind of better understanding between the two superpowers, ultimately leading to what is called Détente. The US recognition of the People's Republic of China in 1972, the signing of the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty or called SALT in the same year, and also the Helsinki Final Act of 1975 were considered as the key achievements of Détente in this period. Yet, the achievement in arms control, improvements in communication and the civility of diplomatic language did not substantially reduce the kind of underlying hostility that existed between the two superpowers. Both sides were entangled in the Arab-Israel War of 1973, and also by the mid 1970s the mood had begun to shift. So, the period of Détente was very short, and again there was a kind of confrontation between the two superpowers, particularly after the mid 1970s. The success of revolution in Ethiopia, Iran, Cambodia, Angola, Afghanistan and Nicaragua in the second half of 1970s, and particularly the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan in 1979 were considered by the critics that America basically followed a kind of soft approach towards the USSR, and that provided a kind of help to the USSR to intervene in these important countries. So, the worldwide spread of communism prompted a kind of view in the United States that its foreign policy was weakening along with poorly performing economy, and that's in a way badly affected by the oil shocks of the 1970s. That was the result of this Arab-Israel War of 1973, and also it led to the decline of the manufacturing base of American economy. So, in a way that badly affected the America's economic performance. These concerns helped Ronald Reagan, who became the USA president in the 1980s, and the advent of what is called the Second Cold War, which was a product of the Reagan administration's military build-up and more assertive anti-communist and anti-Soviet foreign policy. So, because of these domestic concerns, and also because of the personality factor, you can say that Ronald Reagan, who was basically considered as a anti-Soviet US leader, so because he became the president, so these kind of policies, domestic policies, economic performance, military leadership, so all kind of regions were responsible for the new Cold War. Now, let us discuss about the last phase of the Cold War that we can consider from 1985 to 1989, which also led to the end of the Cold War. Reagan's first term in office was characterized by notable hostility towards the Soviet Union, but his attitude basically shifted during his second term, which he got in 1984. Following a summit meeting in Geneva in the late 1985, he became very receptive to Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev's arms reduction proposals, and that in a way enhanced the two states' sense of trust with each other. The Soviet foreign policy reform program also involved a kind of massive reduction in the conventional and the nuclear weapons and a shift to a purely defensive military doctrine. So, in a way focus on defensive military posture, defensive military structure, defensive military doctrine also in a way contributed for more and more trust between the United States and Soviet Union during the last phase. The Soviet Union also adopted a more liberal kind of posture towards the international system, and in a way they discontinued their support to the revolutionary movements and what is called fraternal communist regimes. So, in this period Soviet Union was basically looking inward, it was following a kind of defensive military posture, it was also focusing on internal economic development. These reforms developed in a very peaceful fashion between 1985 to 1989 and famously culminated in what is called the Velvet Revolution in Eastern Europe that led to the democratic transition of these countries, and also it was not just a democratic transition, it was made possible in a very peaceful way. So, in a way So the policies adopted by Gorbachev in a way supported the democratic transition of Eastern European countries, and it was very peaceful. The Soviet leadership also decided that a time has come when they have to change their political strategy and military strategy vis-a-vis the countries of Eastern Europe. In a way, it also contributed for the unification of Germany in the same period when East Germany and West Germany, they united with each other. So the division of Germany, which happened during the Second World War, that ended in 1989 with the unification of two parts of Germany, West Germany and East Germany. In the 1990, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe at its Paris conference officially announced the end of the Cold War, and in 1991 the Soviet Union itself collapsed. So that shows how the Cold War, which we consider as started just after the Second World War, it continued for 4.5 decades, and the two superpowers checkmated each other, and it was a kind of ideological rivalry, military competition that led to nuclear arms race. So this kind of superpower rivalry ended in 1989 officially with the end of the Cold War, and 2 years after the second superpower collapsed, and with the USSR, the communism as an ideology also collapsed. And just after 2 years, Soviet Union, which was posing a kind of countervailing force to the United States, it also collapsed. Now let us discuss why the Cold War ended and what are the important reasons that led to the end of the Cold War that continued for such a long period of time. So there are various reasons that can be considered for the end of the Cold War. Let us discuss the first reason, that is considered as structural weakness of Soviet style communism. There were two types of structural weakness faced by the USSR. The first was economical and the second was political. The economic weaknesses were linked to the inherent failings of the central planning, which proved to be less effective in comparison to the capitalist economies in delivering the general prosperity level and producing modern consumer goods. So if you compare the economic performance of the capitalist country and the communist country, so scholars think that there are so many structural weaknesses in the communist economy. So in a way that structuralness or the poor performance of the communist economy was in a way responsible for the end of the Cold War and also the end of the Soviet Union. The political weaknesses can be understood from the fact that the communist regimes were structurally unresponsive to popular pressure. In particular, the absence of the competitive elections, independent interest groups and a free media that was characterized by the single political party system in Soviet Union. So these were not providing any kind of institutional mechanism for articulating the political discontent and initiating a kind of dialogue between the rulers and the people. So if you compare the democratic political system with the communist political system, you will find there are serious structural differences, like the communist system is ruled by a single political party. There is no opposition, there is no media, there is no pressure group. So in that system it is not possible for the people to have a right kind of dialogue with the government. So that was a kind of political weakness which was responsible for the end of the Cold War and also the collapse of the Soviet Union. Secondly, the impact of Gorbachev's reform process was also responsible for the end of the Cold War. Gorbachev introduced several reforms in the Soviet Union from 1985 onwards. His thinking, his belief in certain changes in the communist system that was in a way responsible for the end of the Cold War. He particularly introduced several reforms in the Soviet Union from 1985 onwards. Particularly he introduced three kinds of reforms. The first was based on his slogan called Perestroika, that involved the introduction of elements of market competition and private ownership. So Gorbachev made some kind of changes in communist economic system by introducing some kind of market competition and introducing the concept of private ownership. The second aspect of the reform process involved the dismantling of restrictions on the expression of opinion and political debate, which is called glasnost. So, this is the second important reform process initiated by Gorbachev. The third and the most crucial aspect of Gorbachev's reform was a new kind of approach towards the United States and also towards the countries of the Eastern Europe, allowing them to have their own government, allowing them to have their own democratic transition, and that happened particularly during Gorbachev's time, because he bluntly refused to intervene in the democratic transition of the countries in the Eastern Europe, and that in a way helped the Eastern European countries to follow democratic changes, to adopt democratic changes in a peaceful way. In a way, this liberal attitude of Gorbachev also helped the fall of Berlin Wall that divided the West Germany from East Germany. Another major reason for the end of the Cold War and the collapse of Soviet Union can be considered as the USA policy, particularly its policy against Soviet Union, what we can call the Second Cold War. The chief external factors contributing to the collapse of communism were the policies of Ronald Reagan in the United States and the advancement of economic and cultural globalization during that period. The Reagan administration's contribution to this process in launching the Second World War by instigating what he called the Strategic Defense Initiative by the United States, pushed Soviet Union to an arms race which was not economically viable, which was not economically sustainable, and that led to the collapse of communism. So, in a way, Ronald Reagan's policies are considered as a kind of external factor that led to the end of the Cold War. Then another factor that led to the end of the Cold War and collapse of Soviet Union is what is called economic and cultural globalization in that period. While the progressive internationalization of trade and investment opportunities provided a kind of opportunities for the technological and economic development in the United States dominated West, since the 1970s onwards, its exclusion from global markets ensured that the Soviet dominated East would suffer from economic stagnation. So, this kind of the economic globalization that in a way contributed for major economic development in the West and in the United States, and the Soviet Union was somehow immune from this kind of global economic developments. Cultural globalization also contributed to the process through the spread of radio and television technology, helping ideas, information and images from an apparently freer and more prosperous West to penetrate to the more developed communist countries, particularly those located in the Europe. So, in a way that also fueled a kind of discontent and bred support for the Western style economic and political reforms. So, if you look at the democratic transition of the East European countries, you will find that they all followed democracy because they were impressed by the economic performance of America and countries in Western Europe, and it was the reason why the Berlin Wall was demolished, and the East Germany decided to be a part of West Germany, and there was unification of Germany. So, the point is economic globalization and a cultural globalization that also in a way contributed for the end of Cold War and the collapse of Soviet Union. Now, let us end our discussion on Cold War by highlighting certain important points. Thus we discussed that there are three key features that define the Cold War. The first one was the threat of nuclear war. The second was the kind of competition the two superpowers were engaged in getting the loyalty of the newly independent countries of Africa, Asia and Latin America, and the third was the military and economic support of each other's enemies around the world. So, if one particular country was denied any kind of economic assistance by one bloc, so that was provided help by the other bloc. So, there was a kind of competition over economic assistance also. So, that defined the whole ideological rivalry, the whole military competition during the Cold War period. But due to a number of internal and external factors, the Cold War rivalry between the East and the West, it ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, there are internal reasons, there are external reasons that we discuss. So, that ended the East-West ideological rivalry. But, the end of the Cold War and the collapse of Soviet Union had some major repercussions to the global, politics in general and international relations in particular. First, the fall of communism created a kind of vacuum that led to the United States to emerge as the only superpower in the world, and with this the United States declared what it called the emergence of a new world order, increasing its unilateral military intervention in the name of democracy in many countries, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in many other parts of the world. So, in a way, US scholars and policymakers, they considered it as a kind of unipolar movement for the United States. Second, the end of the Cold War, in addition to the collapse of the ideology of socialism and socialist bloc, coincided with the acceleration of the process of economic globalization and rapid growth in international trade that we can see in the formation of the WTO or the establishment of WTO in 1995 and the rise of what is called the rule based multilateral international trade regime. So, this whole process of globalization, the establishment of World Trade Organization, the promotion of international trade, they all were possible with the end of the Cold War and the collapse of Soviet Union. So, that in a way was an achievement of the end of ideological rivalry between the two superpowers. Third, new global issues like environmental issue, nuclear proliferation, terrorism, ethnicity based conflicts and violence in the newly independent countries, both in the former USSR, Yugoslavia and many other communist countries, refugees, migration, new conceptual reformulation of the main IR concept like sovereignty, national interest, hard borders, and the emergence of new actors, and also the failure of the mainstream theories to explain the end of the Cold War and collapse of Soviet Union led the mushrooming of critical theories in international relations. So, they were all the major areas, major developments in the field of international relations. So, the end of the Cold War in a way contributed for major theories in international relations, what we call critical theories, make the traditional concept like sovereignty, like national interest, like security, they were all reformulated. Also, important international issues like environmental issue, terrorism, nuclear proliferation, they were all became prominent topic for both the nation states and non-state actors for discussion, for debate, for agenda setting. And lastly, the end of the Cold War also affected the future of non-aligned movement, which was considered as the largest peace movement in the world. So, because the NAM was established as a response to the beginning of Cold War and alliances politics. So, when the Cold War was not there, the Warsaw Pact was not there, there were many who questioned the continuous or continual relevance of NAM. So, NAM was established as a reaction to the Cold War politics by the two superpowers and as a response to their military alliances. So, when the superpower confrontation was not there, when there was no Cold War, so there was no need for NAM. Some people question its relevance, some people question its continuous existence in international politics. So, in a way, the end of the Cold War and the collapse of Soviet Union in a substantial way affected the working of international politics and also the discipline of international politics. So, thank you for your patience. We will start our discussion on another major issue in the next lecture. So, thank you very much.